Welcome to Dignified Resilience, a podcast on fresh narratives on confronting despair, alleviating distress, and forging ahead. I hope that wherever you might be listening to this, you are healthy, safe, patient, and with an open mind and heart for hearing and listening others. I know that a lot of people need to have their mind distracted from the current uncertainty and anxiety. But I also hope that this podcast and different perspectives on resilience, on struggle, on hope, whether from one's experiences or professional work or scholarly studies and insights, will be interesting and beneficial wisdom for you. That you will at least expand your horizons in this time of a global pandemic when we have no idea what will happen next. I wish that we all hear that this way or another, we're going to make through this. As I told you in the introduction, in this podcast, we'll have conversations with people from all over the world at all stages of life and from all industries. That said, considering my own background, I could not imagine moving forward with this podcast in any other way than having the first conversation with a fellow Bosnian. More specifically, a survivor of the Srebrenica genocide, but also prolific writer and academic. Just to make clear and let's establish the truth. The International Court of Justice in The Hague and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia have both ruled that the crimes in Srebrenica were acts of genocide. Now, because we have listeners from all over the world, I have to make a short recap that those familiar with the recent Balkan history might know already. When we speak about the dissolution of Yugoslavia, let's remind that Bosnia and Herzegovina, as one of the constituent republics, held referendum on independence of the country on 29 February and 1st March in 92. Then, over 2/3 of electoral body voted in favor of sovereignty and independence, despite Serbian extremist nationalist provocations. According to international standards, that sufficed for international recognition of the state, which happened soon after. But that was not enough, unfortunately, to stop the bloodshed which ensued, with siege of Sarajevo as the capital, but also with the aggression in other parts of the country as well, which lasted until the end of 95 and took more than 100,000 lives. Now, when we speak about the Srebrenica genocide, we should say it was the worst crime committed on European soil since World War II. Following the capture of Srebrenica by military and police forces of the Republic of Srpska on 11th July 1995, the military and police forces of the Bosnian Serbs killed over 8,000 Muslim men in Srebrenica town in just a few days. In parallel with that execution, the political and military leadership of Bosnian Serbs ordered the forced displacement of women and children from the enclave of Srebrenica, which ended the process of ethnic cleansing in the entire Podrinje region, which actually started in April 92. Let's also remember that this took place in an area declared a UN safe zone by the UN Security Council's Resolution 819. And prior to that horror in 95, I do want to remind our listeners that there were also several years of persecution, torture, much of which was done by neighbors and people who used to be friends or colleagues. So my today's guest is an author of not just one book, but one of them preserves the memory of the horrific sequence of events that documents the pain of living in those horrible circumstances prior to the executions in July 95, where he describes both the hunger of the local population, the events in 93 when actually the then president of United States, Bill Clinton, decided to airdrop food to the enclaves in Eastern Bosnia. So then American planes started dropping packages of food. He might tell us more about it, but in his book, he describes that by April 93, people were eating anything that seemed remotely digestible. Corn cobs, hazel bushes. He talks about another pain, which was shortage of salt. He talks about the situations in medical, well, we can't even call them proper hospitals because there was so much and so many surgical procedures which were performed without anesthetics. He reminds us how the only way to get in touch with family members was through amateur radio operators. If anyone is interested in reading a powerful first-hand account of circumstances of life in years leading up to the genocide in Bosnia, in Srebrenica, sorry, I do recommend a book by Hasan Nuhanovic, who is a dedicated campaigner and activist. The book is called The Last Refuge, a true story of war, survival, and life under siege of Srebrenica, and it was published in 2019. Hassan was saved because he worked as interpreter for UN troops, but his family was taken away and never came back. And I do want to reiterate a couple of other painful facts, because as painful as it is this memory that we must keep by reminding ourselves about it. Even worse than the murder was the process of hiding and destroying evidence of the committed crimes, transfer of bodies of victims from primary graves, and reburial to secondary, sometimes even to tertiary ones. It took a while for the world to learn of Srebrenica as well. It was the United States ambassador to the UN at the time, Madeleine Albright, who presented the global public with evidence of the committed crimes on August 11, 1995, with satellite images of recently excavated mass graves. And then the NATO launched airstrikes against Bosnian Serb forces, not then, but a few weeks later, after massacre of the open market called Markale happened in Sarajevo, resulting in 43 civilian deaths. Peace negotiations in Dayton, in the United States, were concluded at the end of November 1995, ending aggression against Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, we could talk more or not about the problematic peace that ensued after, but that was the end of military aggression. Today, Srebrenica is a municipality within the Bosnian entity of the Republika Srpska. The other entity is called Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Srebrenica has about 7,000 permanent residents. Many survivors were resettled in the surrounding areas, and only a small number of people returned to their pre-war homes. So today, our conversation will be with the director of the Srebrenica Potočari Memorial Center, Dr. Emir Suljagic. As I said, he's not just the survivor of the Srebrenica genocide and director of the Memorial Center, but a prolific writer and academic. He is also a pretty vocal man and a commentator of political realities within Bosnia and outside, quite active on the social media, which sometimes or often brings both praise, public criticism, and unfortunately death threats as well. I'm glad that he found time for joining me today, because there can be no memory without a dedication and commitment for either preserving the historical truth about Bosnian genocide, but also for fighting against the ever-increasing denial of it. So I personally find his role at the Srebrenica Memorial Center absolutely crucial for strengthening that project, which is very fragile in terms of both its financial budget and human capacities. Of course, when I think about dignity and resilience, that institution is incredibly important for moving forward in today's world, when the battle of narratives about the war unfortunately still continues even in peaceful times. I also told Dr. Suljagic that I know we can't escape politics, but that I wish to talk about philosophy with him as well today. I'm not quite sure that he gets asked these sorts of questions a lot, so maybe it's going to be a change for him as well, and he kindly accepted. So hello and welcome to the podcast and to the new Zoom reality. Hi. How are you? Do you hear me? Do you see me? Are you well today?
Thank you for having me on your podcast. First of all, good afternoon or early evening here. I guess I'm doing as well as the next man. I was more than happy to accept your invitation and talk to you about things that we obviously both consider important. And I think it's important at a time like this, especially to keep the awareness um, of, um, of disasters, man-made disasters that we recently witnessed. And in that regard, I thank you for being persistent and being out there.
Thank you. I think we all have a part to do. And one thing that I hope is that we keep allowing each other to recognize that there are all sorts of ways that we can contribute in terms of preserving, regardless of our occupation. And whether it's through writing, talking about it, raising awareness on it, about it, and just putting the narratives out in the public. So, considering that there is a global pandemic right now, and your title at the Srebrenica Memorial Center in Potocari, I was wondering, how is the pandemic affecting your work there? Are you preparing some specific online learning resources? What's going on right now?
Well, a lot of our activity obviously revolves around visits and visitors. And in that respect, we are in a position that other memorials and museums are in. We have had to close down the memorial, the museum part of the memorial, but also with the risk of erring on the side of caution, decided to close down the cemetery. So obviously we can control the numbers of people who go in and out. So what we did in the meantime, we've sort of ventured, and I think it's interesting that a memorial dedicated to genocide is actually the first in Bosnia to venture into virtual tours, YouTube channel. We are, as an institution, sort of also active um, on social platforms. I personally believe in outsourcing the message as much as possible, once, of course, the message is clearly defined. And we will be doing some other things very soon in preparation for the 25th anniversary. That we're actually, so there's a project that we're developing right now that will also allow us to outsource, to crowdsource, if you will, the anniversary, especially, to invite as many people as possible to join us in commemorating the victims of July 1995. Although I would have to kind of take exception here to what seems to be the prevalent truth of our time, which is that genocide is somehow and exclusively only related to those events of July 1995. I argue, and I have argued, and I believe I'm right there, that Srebrenica was only a culmination of a 3.5-year policy. That policy has unfortunately been named ethnic cleansing, and there's a very interesting etymology behind the notion of ethnic cleansing. But essentially, it was part of the vocabulary of the perpetrators that was picked up by the primarily Western media, and even more importantly, policy community that was kind of bent on trying to find ways not to act in the face of what was obviously tantamount to genocide, what was obviously genocide going on, unfolding in Bosnia. And that's another part of what we want to do with the memorial. We want to commemorate other victims outside those of July 1995. The Bosniak Muslim population of the Drina Valley was targeted for extermination starting in April and May 1992. And obviously, to somehow and completely artificially separate those victims from those in July 1995 is not historically true. And then, of course, there is this period between, say, May 92 and April 93, where the town itself was under probably the most brutal siege that this country has witnessed. And the number of dead from that period have never been counted. And that's have not even been counted, you know? So that's another thing that we're going to be doing very soon. We want to sort of, you know, set up, to try and put together a whole narrative, a wider narrative of how, why it got to where it got in July 1995. And obviously, you know, when you look at the UN document, you see UN documents referring to slow motion genocide already in April 1993. Now, why have there been all these qualifications around the word genocide in 92 and 93? I don't know. I wish I did. I wish it didn't have as much as I believe it did have to do with the fact that the victims were actually Muslims and that they were Muslims in Europe.
Mhm.
So anyway, so that's another, you know, one of the other things that we're doing.
Of course, if I may just ask you and remind that another reason why the memorialization is so important beyond the obvious is that the entire generations of Bosniaks were wiped out, and a lot of survivors are now dying. So, how are you making sure that the stories of and the testimonies are being collected? um, I remember that I heard that you were collecting the belongings, or that you were inviting the survivors to provide the institution with any items which belong to the victims, correct?
Yeah, that's what we're doing. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to save both artifacts and the narrative that goes with them. You know, it's very I I I I, I have to choose my words carefully because, you know, to say you're doing well in relation to some project within a genocide memorial um, is I know it may cause wonder or consternation on parts of people, but I'm sorry, that's simply how it is. So we're doing well in terms of artifacts collection. I think, you know, and people have been, survivors and families have been more than sort of more than welcome. They've welcomed us. They've welcomed this initiative. I've heard a lot of questions about, you know, why this wasn't done earlier, and there is an explanation. I mean, you know, we really didn't know what we wanted to do. I mean, us survivors, you know, started out as a cemetery. You know, we have to remember that. You know, that 17 years ago, the idea was, okay, let's just bury them there, and that idea slowly evolved into developing a memorial. And now we, you know, are sort of putting in place final pieces of the vision of this memorial. We have been less successful, and I'm going to say that, but with collecting stories with oral history. Part of the reason was that there was no infrastructure in place when I got there. We are not putting it in place. And sooner rather than later, what we will do is we'll start our own oral history project. We don't need, how can I say, we don't need hundreds of thousands of dollars or euros to, you know, and those fancy projects. I believe we have enough at the memorial. Of course, getting some money, you know, to actually pay some extra people would be great, but that doesn't matter. We will continue to do that. And what we also did is we went around, and that was probably the most horrific part of what I did, what we did ever since I got there. And I only got there, you know, it's kind of interesting. I only got there in October last year, and it happened on the day I was actually appointed. I was supposed to be appointed the head of the memorial on the day my mother died. And I was in fact on my way from the the university where I teach in Sarajevo here, when they called me from the hospital to say that my mom had died. And but anyway, I found it really. I found it, I thought the life was kind of playing with me again. Um, One of the things that we did, we also, so to get back to answering your question, we also put together a small team of survivors and people working at the memorial. And they took the route of the Death March from July '95, and you wouldn't believe the kind and the amount of artifacts that were still there 25 years later, and that they had collected. And we took care to carefully note. We took the coordinates, we filmed the environment, the surrounding. I mean, we just kind of developed our own methodology for it. And we took care to ensure that there is a very clear chain of custody there. And on one or two occasions, the survivors who are working for the memorial on that particular project actually found human bones as well. So, and that's the challenge of doing what we're doing. I mean, there's still 1,700 people that we're looking for from July 1995 alone, and nobody's saying where they are. Everybody's keeping quiet. This wall of silence was kind of broken only once or twice in the last 25 years.
I think that it's important also to tell our listeners who might not be familiar that, which is another challenge that survivors of the Bosnian genocide are facing, is that, based on the work by Gregory Stanton, who is a genocide scholar and president of the Genocide Watch, which is an organization dedicated to identifying and preserving genocides, as a non-linear process, we have kind of learned that genocide develops usually in 10 stages, and ideally, as Gregory Stanton said, by recognizing these different stages, we should also be able to develop preventive measures to stop it. And those 10 stages are classification, symbolization, discrimination, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, persecution, extermination, denial. Now, what I think that people around the world also need to be aware of, which is, I believe, specific for the current situation in Bosnia, is something that Haris Halilovic, who is a Bosnian scholar based in Australia, studied, and he wrote that, if unpunished, genocide can also result in 11th stage, which he entitled triumphalism. In this stage, as Professor Halilovic says, perpetrators, their sponsors, and the politics behind genocide do not deny the killings anymore, but glorify them, celebrate their deeds, humiliate the survivors, build monuments to the perpetrators at the sites of the massacres, and create a culture of triumphalism, such has been seen in the parts of Bosnia where Serb militias committed genocide against Bosniaks. So when we speak about, all sorts of challenges, it's not just the denial. Unfortunately, what we've been witnessing is the triumphalism of genocide. So considering that reality, which we know exists in Bosnia, why is it additionally important to keep sharing the facts and stories, not only for Bosnia's own sake, Dr. Suljagic, but also because of the new situation with the far right around the world being inspired by the Bosnian genocide and this nonchalant triumphalism of it?
Well, we live in a state of permanent glorification of genocide. And the Memorial Center also operates in an environment that is steeped in glorification of genocide. And just last year, or actually this year, January 6th, as part of the celebration of the Orthodox Christmas, a column of tractors and cars drove right next to the memorial and to the cemetery, playing loud nationalist music. The government in this part of this Serb-administered part of Bosnia is also systematically denying what the events of July 1995 and has invested enormous amounts of money in creating a counterfactual narrative about what happened here. And this is the first time I'm actually talking about it, but very soon the memorial will issue what we are hoping is going to be its first annual report on genocide denial. And it's going to come out in both English and Bosnian. And what we will try to do as well is, and we already kind of tried to frame it in that part of it in that way, try and sort of put it out there as part of this growing wave of Islamophobia in the world and growing wave of far right. And interestingly, and I kind of wrote about it. Actually, I did write a little about it. You know, figures such as Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic have been instrumental to, if you will, rebirth of this far right. Let's call it openly fascist and racist wave that's been hitting the entire world from U.S. to Australia.
Sure.
And it's, you know, it's kind of interesting phenomenon that the murder of the Bosnian Muslims has served as an inspiration to this wave of far right extremism and you know, on some occasions terrorism as well. And I think it's a question that deserves a lot more study. And given what's going on right now, given the epidemic, I believe that we're going to see more of that once the epidemic settles down. I think we're already seeing it in India. But we'll probably see it across Europe and probably in the United States, which I'm really heartbroken, about seeing what's going on in the U.S. right now. Honestly, I truly am. But we'll see more of it. We'll see nationalists or far right extremists from Milorad Dodik, the president of the Bosnian Serb entity in Bosnia, to other political figures, somehow making the connection between the virus and the Muslims worldwide. And that's something that we should also, we should also be very careful about in weeks and months, and obviously, years ahead of us.
Yeah. If we speak of classifications, I wanted to also mention another more healing one, I guess. As many listeners might know, in 1969, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross first identified the stages of dying in her transformative book On Death and Dying. And then decades later, she and David Kessler wrote the classic book on grief and grieving, introducing the stages of grief most of us are now familiar with: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And so now, actually last year, Mr. Kessler published a new book based on his difficult, hard-earned personal experiences, as well as knowledge and scholarly work regarding grieving. And he introduced a critical sixth stage. I was wondering, are you aware of, do you know what it is? I'll tell you, but
No,
do you know?
No, I don't.
Okay, I think the book was published in November 2019, but David Kessler argues now that there's sixth stage, and that it is finding meaning beyond the stages of grief most of us are familiar with, that can transform grief into a more peaceful and hopeful experience. So I was wondering, have you gotten to that stage yet?
I don't even know about the other stages, to be completely honest.
You were probably
Uh,
experiencing them, even though, of course, the
yeah.
authors say that it's not prescriptive, it's descriptive of what
No,
might.
no, listen, the thing is, I'm not, I've only read probably as much psychology as I needed to pass a few exams in my undergrad studies. I've sort of went the other way. And what did I find meaning? I don't know. I think you could say that probably for the first time in my life, I'm actually doing the job that means something to me in a way that no other job did.
Mm-hmm.
Um, every time every day I go to work, I pass by the cemetery where essentially everyone I knew is buried, or most of them. I see the bigger picture. I see what the bigger role of what I'm doing is. I see the bigger picture for the institution. Um, in a way, again, for me personally, this has to do a lot with my mom. It's when she died of cancer, and it didn't take very long. It took essentially from the end of July until mid-October. She didn't want me to have this job. She wanted me close by. She wanted me somewhere where she can reach me by phone, where I can be, around within an hour or so.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't want me taking the risk of taking this job, and in a way, you know, and I know if she'd stayed alive, she'd finally say, okay, yeah, that's, you've never listened to me anyway about what you do and stuff like that. And she'd come to terms with it. But to me, this job is a lot about that. And yes, you're right. I mean, it's probably more meaningful than anything that I've ever done in my life. It's something that something I something I wanted to do for a very long time as well. But I'm glad I didn't. Um, I don't think I would have been ready for it. I think I'm right now at this stage in my life where I have both the experience of the last 25 years, well, last 30 years behind me. Um, what I've learned, what I've picked up on, and I also have, so I'm a local. I'm one of these guys. So and it's really important, when you come here and you actually live with the other survivors who have come back. It's kind of important that you're one of them. It's important to them. It's important to me. I am more peaceful now than I ever was, which you, of course, wouldn't be able to say based on my Twitter feed, but that's a different matter.
That's what I said. You don't usually get asked this sort of question, so I was excited to kind of put you in a different framework. And I actually read about your mom, and you spoke and wrote of her at various places, and spoke of her resilience and described experience of her and your sister. And you wrote, "My mother never looked back on that period of her life. She always tried to encourage us to move on and look forward." And
It's not just a figure of speech. Trust me, that's who she was. The next battle on the horizon, it's as simple as that. It's
yeah,
life is such that it doesn't really allow you to sit and mourn. And whereas that may have been kind of, but whereas that may have been helpful, and certainly was helpful in many ways, for me to, in that period of my life when I was adjusting from being um, a, a survivor, to being a student, a journalist, a functioning member of the community. That certainly was a great to have someone like that around. It was, she was tough as nails. She broke no BS, and it was, she wouldn't allow me to brood. She wouldn't allow me to despair over anything. There was only one answer to every single question. You get up and do it. get up and do it, work. So yeah, and honestly, I have not spoken with her for 6 months like this. So in a way, I kind of owe you. I want to say thank you.
I hope I didn't trigger a bad.
No. I've you know, it's a.
I think that resilience that you spoke of and that dignity is what I always find in stories of so many Bosnian women. And I hope that I will have an episode of this podcast specifically on that and beyond Bosnian context as well. I was actually just yesterday watching an episode that Oprah did with Dr. Edith Eva Eger, who is a Holocaust survivor and trauma expert. And she now uses her experience to help others learn to move past suffering. And also, Dr. Edith spoke of her mom in the book The Choice, which she published, a memoir in 2017, where she explores the nature and the power of healing. And she said that at each gathering today with her clients, or whether it's soldiers or military that she counsels or whoever it might be, she repeats what her mother told her the day they were taken by the Nazis. And that was that we don't know where we're going, we don't know what's going to happen, but no one can take away from you what you put in your own mind. So she always mentions the words of her mother. And then I saw that quote, an article about your own. So I just thought that those words, in terms of consolation and comfort, kind of resonated. What do you think about those Dr. Edith's mom's words in terms of the importance of what we put in our mind, in terms of the narratives that we say each other, for resilience, for preserving dignity, for just kind of moving on in circumstances that many never should experience?
I mean, I don't know. My mom wasn't that eloquent, if you will, or articulate. She was a peasant woman from rural Eastern Bosnia. But there is something about this particular group of Bosnian women, let me tell you that. They bore the brunt of what happened here between 92 and 95. And they are the unsung heroes of this country, as far as I'm concerned. They came out of what was, by all standards, a post-apocalyptic world. That's what Srebrenica was for 3 years. And they came out, with their husbands and brothers and fathers killed, and kids to support, children to support. And they did it admirably, all of them. I was living illegally in the student dormitory in Sarajevo, and there were like two of us. It was a 2-bedroom, but there were 4 of us. 2 of us from Srebrenica, and the other 2 from another enclave of Gorazde. And it was like a room full of PTSD. So anyway, one day I'm sitting there, and somebody's knocking at the door, and I open the door, and it's my mom. And I'm like, okay, Mom, what's going on? What are you doing here? Well, listen, buses came for us, because she used to live in a refugee camp in Tuzla at that point in time. And I was in Sarajevo taking my studies, and buses came for us. They unloaded us somewhere in the middle of nowhere. They told us that we could go and live in empty houses. So I just wanted to let you know I'm there, and pack half your stuff and move out there. You're not going to live alone. And I'm like, I was sitting there and I couldn't believe it. I just, I couldn't believe her. And then we moved into an empty house that I had no idea who we belonged to. Mm-hmm. We spent 4 years living there. We moved out when the owner came back. And, that episode alone kind of testifies, it really tells me more about my mom than pretty much anything else, that she would just do it. Okay, um, it's another obstacle to overcome. All right, let's do it. Let's overcome it. And again, this is the woman she completed only 4 grades of elementary school, because that was the norm for women at that, when she was back at that age, when she was living in rural Eastern Bosnia, and even that was too much. Her father was an imam, and he even advised her, to pretend that she was mute when she was undergoing elementary school examination. But my mom couldn't keep quiet. She just couldn't keep quiet, and she ended up, at least taking those 4 grades. And I used to joke with her, if she had completed, just a secondary school, she'd be up there with Margaret Thatcher. That's who she was. But anyway, so it took me decades to understand what my father taught me, and I was 17 years old when I lost him.
Mm-hmm.
And his death was in December '92. And I didn't have a lot of time to deal with it. I dealt with it incrementally, in spoonfuls, if you will, occasionally, because there was the pressure in the air of having to survive. I think my mom dying hurt a lot more in a way, because it was peace. It was peacetime. In my world, people don't get hurt in peacetime. People get hurt in wartime. I mean, that's how I thought. One of the last things that my mom did for me was actually by ensuring that I actually transition into a peacetime world. And this is the first time that I'm living in peace, at peace.
Before I get to 5 sweet questions, as I call them, I wanted to also ask, and this is different than questions that you get asked a lot about possibilities of reconciliation and why has it not happened and why do you think it will happen and what is required for it. And you can touch upon that if you'd like, but I did want to ask you about hope more specifically and potentially separately from that question and the immediate reality and your professional endeavor as well. Are you a pessimist by nature? Have you always been a pessimist, optimist? Has it changed? Is it changing?
Honestly, I admire people who do. I admire their.
Who hope?
It takes, it takes a certain kind of fortitude.
Fellow Bosnian speaking, by the way.
Yeah.
Just saying, note, my husband claims that I have something called Balkan paranoia, which does not allow me to enjoy life, as he claims, because precisely I see everything as a potential disaster, or when it's not a disaster, I feel it's not normal, So I learn and teach myself to be an optimist for a change, if I may, at situations. But I hear what you're saying.
It takes a certain kind of fortitude to be hopeful that I don't have. That's it. Simple as that. And I don't kind of give a lot. I don't care very much for hope. I'm a hopeful person. I'm not saying that hope doesn't necessarily play a role in the lives of every single one of us individually. You have to be hopeful. For this or that, otherwise, but in the bigger picture, it's not a very good ally. That's as simple as that. I'm not, and I'm building more
hope too. Hope does not, in my opinion, always have to be illusion, or I think hope.
But it's usually, it's very often delusion. So that's
That's why I'm teaching myself to kind of just be hopeful as an active way of working, realizing that the world is a messed up place, but that I think what you're doing, or I think that this podcast is a manifestation of hope, that I'm providing a meaningful content that will be beneficial to somebody. And I think that what you're doing is also a manifestation of your conscious or unconscious hope that our generations of not just Bosniaks, but all the people of good faith will know that very bad things happen, but that they should never happen again. And that we're constantly and actively showing that we're here. I think that, like you mentioned, I think any return to Srebrenica of any person, of any survivor, yours as being the director of that memorial center, is a manifestation of dignity and also victory of life over death. I think that that is hope, but you may not acknowledge.
I'm not.
I'm kidding.
I'm not saying you're not. I'm not saying you're wrong. You're right. And again, rationally, I completely understand. But I essentially what I've been through between May '92 and July '95 has turned me into who I am. I mean, it's been the formative part of my life. It is the kind of experience that defined me, and I, as hard as I could to run away from that, I spent years, sometimes even defiantly, running away from that, trying to be other things, trying to be other people, until a period of my life in the Hague, where I had this dubious privilege of covering the work of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia for 2.5 years, and it was kind of, that's when I realized that you don't get to run away from that. You may try, but I kind of, by doing that, I kind of re-traumatized myself in a way that made me understand that it was impossible for me to detach myself from that. What going to The Hague and working there sort of did for me, I actually had to relearn some of the things that I'd survived, and I managed to kind of take a step back and see the bigger picture, and realized that what I felt instinctually, that there is a bigger story behind it. That we were also killed as part of a narrative. That our lives and deaths, and that's how my friends' lives ended, how my relatives' lives ended, was part of another narrative. Was on a larger kind of, I don't know what it's going to be, larger text on the idea, on the social construction of Muslims and the Serb elites. And you see that some of these guys were really out of the Middle Ages. So we were killed as part of a story. We were killed as part of someone's story about themselves, and it really kind of changed everything. And I noticed this, when I was out there, and you'd be meeting people, and when you talk about your personal experience, they're somehow accepting. The moment you start putting your experience in a bigger narrative, in a bigger, your story being part of a bigger story, people kind of tend to step back and say, hey, no. I remember there was this one stage where everybody was talking about de-ethnifying the crimes. And it didn't make sense back then. It doesn't make sense today. I mean, you couldn't say that the people who were killing Jews in Krakow in 1943 were not Germans. Of course, they were Germans. The people who were killing Bosniaks in Srebrenica in 92 or in 95 they were Serbs. So, how can you detach one's identity from acts that are being committed on behalf of that identity?
Well, of course, in terms of reconciliation, there is certainly need for leadership that is not existent right now in the region for this to be absolutely meaningful and all-encompassing. So I said I'm learning to be hopeful, but on this right now, in this particular moment, I can't be because of such, as we mentioned, um, overwhelming denial by large majorities of people who are just put in this veil of ignorance and denial. But I want to remain optimistic. I don't know, but optimistic does not mean delusional or not cognizant of facts. Hence this podcast, hence my writing and talking and educating friends around me, and hence my humility to learn and amplify the voices of survivors everywhere. But I do want to come to fun 5 questions. I mean, not that the other things were not fun, but actually this is actually fun. The first thing is, once the current emergency is over, we might maybe forget some things, but what would you not want to forget?
It's not going to be a fun answer, honestly. What I'm not going to forget about the epidemic is the fact that a lot of the same people, or those who subscribe to the ideology that's behind the murder of Bosniaks in the 90s, have not changed their views on that, even at the time of pandemic. Yeah, that's one thing I'm not going to forget. That's one thing I'm never going to forget. But that's just me.
Mm-hmm. But then, maybe related to it, which of your personality traits has been most useful? And when I mean most useful, I don't think about the best trait. I think which of your traits has been the most useful. And of course, the context matters and the context varies. But if you were to ask yourself, I'm hoping for a fun answer here. Fingers crossed.
Persistence.
Persistence.
Okay. Yeah, persistence, but persistence more than anything else.
Twitter crowd, he's persistent and saying it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm actually, yeah, I don't give up. I have never given up on anything that I've ever tried, and I've always, if there's one thing that I'm aware about myself and that has helped me in my life, it's been the fact that I'm persistent. Because essentially, I got out of Srebrenica as a 20-year-old guy with not even a high school diploma, and I had to play catch up for a lot of my life in many ways. And I'm still playing catch up. And on some things I've given up, like, I don't know, classical music, for instance. I've given up on that, all right? But on, on the things that are important to me and that I cannot give up on, I've been working at them relentlessly. And that's, one of those things that, again, I see my mom, and, I recognize that part of my character as my mom's, because that's who she was. My father was more of a bon vivant. My mom was more of a soldier, and I believe I inherited that from her.
Mm. So when you have 30 minutes of free time, how do you pass that time? I know now free time. Well,
no, usually. Right?
Normally,
no, actually,
or how do you, what is it? You gave up on classical music, but you do have a greenhouse. I mean, like, you plant vegetables.
Yeah, here's the thing. If I have 30 minutes completely under my control, I usually read. That's what I do. Faith by Matthew Carr. It's about the destiny of the Andalusian Muslims. And I'm rereading Bergen and Luckman classic on social construction. But that's what I do when I have everything under control. Growing plants and owning a greenhouse is really about keeping this place alive. You know, it's for me. I thought that this place died at one point in my life, and then by complete accident, I kind of helped bring it to life in 2012. I need this geography in my life, and this is a way of keeping me here. And my mom spent a good part of her last years here, and this geography is essentially the first thing I remember. You know, like, and nobody gets to take that away from me.
I was wondering if I was hoping or wondering whether gardening would be the answer to my next question, because it was, what skill or craft would you like to master?
I think I'm done.
Oh, come on, giving up on classical music, gardening. Like, no, come on.
I'm done with skills or crafts. All right, that's it. What I know, I know. I'm 45 years old. I mean, what I've learned. That's it.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, listeners, this is perfect answer for resilience. Like, he's giving up. Man is giving up on everything.
No, I'm giving up. No,
but he is persistent.
No, hold on a second. I'm not giving up on anything that I know. I know Microsoft Office. I know basic computers.
You learn Zoom.
I know Zoom. I know Skype. I know Gmail. So you know, I come from a very long family of you know, with the very long tradition of surviving. You know, and
of course,
part of that, you know, you pick stuff along the road that you need to survive. Whatever is excess, you throw it away, and that's it. That's how I kind of tend to live. And I never, ever, I never get attached to things. That's one thing that, you know, I'm kind of thankful that my life.
Which now leads me to another interesting question, which I must separate myself from. What?
I'm not being a very interesting conversationist here, but hey, you
know. No, absolutely. Some of it rings a lot of bell with conversations I have with my own husband, who is not Bosnian. Right. So it does ring a bell, but I'm at least training myself to keep pushing forward. I'm a little bit younger than you, so I'm not giving up on some things yet. Are any of your friends completely opposite to you, or are most of them similar to you?
Listen, I'm going to quote a good friend of mine, which is, and you probably know him. His name is Rauf Vajrovic, okay? And Rauf, I've learned a lot with Rauf. I've learned a lot from Rauf. He's a great guy. And one of the things that I've learned from him is that the basic sort of criteria for establishing, you know, relationship or relations with people is to agree on my own opinion of me. Okay, so unless we agree about me, there's really no point of entering into any kind of relationship. Now, I mean, it sounds a lot better in Bosnian. In Bosnian, it's like, you know, it's like.
But wait, but what does that still mean for the answer to the question?
Well, I don't have a lot of friends who are very different from me.
Okay.
I've, you know, people I consider friends are people I agree with in terms of our worldview, and people who I survived genocide with. And, you know, my friends come from these two groups of people. I'm not saying all of these groups, both of these groups, you know, in their totality are friends of mine. I mean, I've got like, yeah.
Well, I think that I would like to continue with these fun questions, but I will only ask 5, and I want to ask 5 same questions to every person I have in the future as well, to kind of go beyond professional endeavors of each conversational companion that will be guest on this podcast. But I think that this time-wise also brings us towards the end. And before we kind of end this meeting, and of course, thank you so much for your time and for your honest and kind of personal and inputs that I don't think a lot of people who follow you get to hear very often. And one of the aims of this podcast for me as well is to have this sort of humane conversations and personal and intimate, of course, that will bring us closer, and that will get to know, that will make the listeners get to know these people a little in a different light than maybe just professionally as well. So thank you so much. Is there anything that you would want to share with the listeners at the end in terms of the adapting to the pandemics and the new circumstances? A lot of them are now experiencing some things for the first time. I mean, David Kessler also wrote an article that a lot of people are experiencing collective grief, of course, without equating the suffering of genocide survivors. But again, some Holocaust survivors are offering their insights and inputs. Is there anything that you would want to share at the end?
Well, to the people who are facing this kind of calamity for the first time in their life, the only thing that I can advise right now is preservation across the board: preservation of energy, preservation of resources, preservation of maybe I mean, just stay where you are, hunker down, try and preserve as much as you can. Stick with your family. I know that my life changed after my family was no longer together, after it was broken apart. So stick with your families, spend time with your family first and foremost, and preservation of emotions, preservation of resources, preservation of energy. The key word is preservation. Just we're going to get out from under this. We'll probably wake up in a completely different world, and you're going to need everything that you have in the meantime successfully preserved.
There you have it. He says he's not hopeful, but there are glimmers of hope from his lessons out there. So thank you very much for your time again. And to all those listeners, please feel free to invite your friends to subscribe. Stay tuned for a lot of exciting guests. The next one is from a completely different part of the world, and I'm very excited and honored that I will have that conversation. So stay tuned, and thank you, and hold tight to those you love.